we're going to talk about how energy flows through an ecosystem. All right, we'll talk about food chains, food webs, and food pyramids. All right, so you know what a chain is? A chain is like different things linked together, and that's basically like what a food chain is. The food chain always begins with the sun. All right, we're gonna go ahead and watch a short video on food chain. And as we watch, I do want you to take note. You should be asking yourself, what is a food chain? And that's what I want you to get away with.
Not everybody likes the same kind of food, right? That's probably a good thing. I mean, all the more pizza for me. But whether we eat milkshakes or mangoes, pizzas or pears, tacos or toast, we use the energy that's in our food to stay alive. But how did that energy get into our food in the first place? The answer is that energy flows between living things. It's almost like each form of food is a link in a chain. A food chain. You might have heard that humans are on the top of the food chain because we eat pretty much everything, and except for the occasional video game monster and maybe the odd bear, nothing tries to eat us. But what is a food chain exactly? A food chain is a model that shows how energy flows between living things. You can think of animals and plants in the same food chain as all living in the same neighborhood, which scientists call a habitat. And they all have a job to do, interacting with each other day in and day out. Together, they form a kind of system, a self-contained collection of different things that all work together as a whole. And they also interact with the non-living stuff around them, like the water, the air, the ground, and the sun. Put it all together, and what do you get? A special system called an ecosystem. And food chains show us what eats what in an ecosystem. Now, everything that's alive is in a food chain, including you, my friend. And actually, most living things are in more than one food chain, depending on what or who they're munching on at the moment. I mean, you don't eat the same thing for dinner every night, do you? Didn't think so. Now, let's see how a food chain works by making a diagram of how these interactions happen in nature. First, all of the energy that's in a food chain starts with the sun. I can't stress that enough, people. Plants take the energy from the sun's rays and change it into chemical energy. So when a nice patch of lush green grass starts to grow, it's capturing some of the energy from the sun to do it. Then when an animal, like a rabbit, wanders by and nibbles on that grass, the energy from the plant is transferred into the rabbit's body. Now, if a hungry hawk decides that the rabbit would make a yummy supper, then the energy from the rabbit is transferred to the hawk. And in this ecosystem, nothing is large or brave enough to take on the hawk. I mean, just look at her. So we've hit the top of the food chain, and we've just made a nifty model of it. So a food chain is a model that shows how energy flows between living things in an ecosystem. Energy in a food chain starts with the sun, which is turned into chemical energy by plants. And this energy moves up the food chain as animals eat the plants, and then other animals eat those animals. And speaking of energy, I'm starving, so I'm off to take my place in the food chain. See you next time.
All right, so basically, food chain is a model, and it shows how energy flows from between living things in an ecosystem. So it always begins with the sun, all right, because the plants use the sun to make food for themselves through a process called photosynthesis. All right, and what is this? This is like a chemical reaction in which the plants use water, carbon dioxide, the light from the sun, and then they make food for themselves, glucose. All right, so now when they make this food, some of that food is stored and then some is used to grow, and the one that's stored is stored as sugar. Organisms that can make glucose during photosynthesis are called producers, all right? And we remember that producers, like the word produce, means to make. Plants are producers. they produce or make their own food. So again, the food chain starts off with the sun and then passes on energy to the producers. Producers use most of the energy they make for themselves. All right. Now, this arrow right here shows you the flow of energy. All right. So the energy, the food flows from this producer to this organism over here. So from the tree to the giraffe. Now, whatever energy is stored and is not used by the producer is what ends up being passed on to the organism that eats it. All right. So basically, when this plant stores energy, because it's going to use some of that energy to grow, to make more leaves and things like that. And so, whatever energy is stored, whenever a giraffe or an organism eats it, it passes on that stored energy from itself to the next organism. All right, organisms that cannot make their own energy are consumers. Consumers consume, they just eat, right? So these are examples of consumers over here: fish, bear, rabbit, lion. Now, there are different classifications of consumers that we've also talked about previously. Consumers that eat producers, we call them the primary consumers. So they're the primary consumers. All right, and these are usually herbivores. And remember, when we talked about herbivores and we broke down this word part, we talked about herb means plant and vor means one that eats. So herbivores are plant eaters. So in this food chain here, as I'm looking at the arrow is showing me the flow of energy. So it would start off with the sun. Always remember the sun. And it passes on the energy to the producer. Here we've got maize. And then the producer is passing on energy to the locust. And this is a primary consumer. And so energy is passed on to it when it eats or consumes the maize. All right, most of the energy the primary consumer gets from the producer is used by the consumer. All right, the consumer does store some energy as well. Now, consumers or animals or eaters that eat other consumers are called secondary consumers. So they may be either carnivores because they eat only meat, or they might be omnivores, all because they eat both meat and plants. Now, the secondary consumers can also be predators or they can be scavengers as well. So in this case, the lizard is a secondary consumer. Again, with the food chain, we're starting off with the sun. It's passing on energy to the maize. The maize passes on energy to the locust when it eats it. And the locust passes on energy to the lizard whenever the lizard eats the locust. All right. So it's showing us the flow of energy. And this is a food chain, it's just a model. Most of the energy that a secondary consumer gets from the primary consumer is used up by the secondary consumer. So now this is the tertiary consumer. All right, so a consumer that eats a consumer that already ate a consumer is called a tertiary consumer. All right, so in this case, we've got the snake eating the lizard that already ate the locust. All right, so they might either be carnivores eating only meat, or omnivores eating both meat and plants. Also, they might be predators or scavengers. So basically, a food chain just shows you like one line in which the energy is transferred between living things. Now we're going to go ahead and talk about food web and what the difference between a food chain and a food web is. So while a food chain is just showing us something really simple, a food web shows multiple food chains together. All right, so think of like a spider web where you can see different lines. So a food web would show you multiple food chains together. All right, to help us better understand a food web, we're going to go ahead and watch this video about food webs.
So last time we put a polar bear in the desert, and I still feel bad about that. The good news is that in real life, a polar bear probably won't just wander into the Sahara. But not everything stays in the same habitat all the time. A new species might come into a habitat, a species might die off. Even the habitats themselves can change as a result of things like floods and droughts. Point is, habitats and the food webs they support can get out of whack, and sometimes it's not pretty. Let's look at what happens when an ecosystem gets out of balance. Last week, we learned that a habitat is home to a tangle of food chains called food webs. The animals depend on each other for food, but they don't just need each other. They rely on the non-living things in the habitat too. This interaction of living and non-living things in a habitat is called an ecosystem. The things in an ecosystem are all connected. Just like when you touch one part of a spider web and the whole thing vibrates, when one link in the food web is threatened, it can shake up the whole ecosystem. Let's see what might happen, for example, if an ecosystem loses a species.
All right, so a food web basically is multiple food chains linked together. All right, just a quick review. Consumers that eat producers and other consumers are called omnivores because they eat them all. Omni, remember, means all. They eat both plants and they eat animals. Consumers that hunt and kill other animals are called predators, while the animals that are being hunted and killed are called prey. So in this instance, this is the predator right here, and here is the prey. Consumers that eat other consumers that have already been killed or they're already dead are called scavengers. Scavengers are searchers, all right? So they're only searching for stuff that's already dead. Here is a quick model of a food chain, and we can see energy being transferred from the sun to the producers, from the producers to the primary consumer, from the primary consumer to the secondary consumer, and from the secondary consumer to the tertiary consumer. And here is a model of a food web. As you can see, it's really interwoven. All right, it is interconnected. It's showing you multiple food chains connected together. So if you think about it, you have several different organisms that may eat the same kind of living thing or organism. And so that's what this basically shows. All right, it shows the relationship. It shows the feeding relationship in an ecosystem. Now, another way that we can show how energy is transferred from one living thing to another living thing is through an energy pyramid. So an energy pyramid is also a model. It's showing you that pyramid, how energy is transferred. All right, here it's not showing you the sun. Always remember that everything starts off with the sun. All right, so we've got the sun and then the producers, and right above is showing us how energy is being transferred to herbivores or primary consumers. And from the primary consumers, energy is transferred to the secondary consumers or carnivores or omnivores, and then to the tertiary consumers. You would notice like the pyramid is getting smaller as it gets to the top. That's because of the amount of energy being transferred is less. All right, so plants get or producers get their energy from the sun, and they use up some of that energy and only store 10% of the energy. Now they transfer the 10% of that energy to the herbivores, and the herbivores, remember, they only get 10% of the energy from the sun that they got through the producer. So they use up some of it, only store 10% of 10%, which is actually 1%. All right, and so that's transferred here, and then as it goes up as well. So when you're thinking about food and thinking about getting energy, you would realize that when you eat veggies or fruits or producers, you end up having more energy than when you feed on other consumers. All right, so this energy pyramid is showing us the amount of energy available and showing us how it decreases as it goes through that food chain. All right, it takes a large number of producers to support a small number of primary consumers. It also takes a large number of these primary consumers to be able to support and fill up the secondary consumers, and so on. All right, so again, as energy moves up from the sun to the producers, and then the primary consumers, the secondary consumers, and the tertiary consumers, energy is being lost because some of that energy is used to grow, to move, and to do things, and we only store about 10% of the energy. All right, so it gets lost through the energy pyramid. An energy pyramid is another way to show how energy is transferred. All right. So a quick recap on what a food chain is. A food chain is just a model that shows how energy flows. Food web is multiple food chains interconnected. And then the energy pyramid is also another model that shows how energy flows through living things in an ecosystem. And that wraps it up for the day.